Imagine a stretch of ocean, twice the size of the Mediterranean, through which a third of all global trade passes every year. Picture trillions of dollars worth of oil, gas, and fish hidden beneath turquoise waters dotted with coral reefs and islands claimed by multiple countries. Now imagine this region bristling with warships, fighter jets, and Coast Guard cutters playing a dangerous game of chicken, sometimes just meters apart. Welcome to the South China Sea, the world's most volatile maritime hotspot, where the stakes are rising every week, and the risk of open conflict now feels uncomfortably real. This isn't just about obscure shoals and islands far from view. The drama unfolding here blows right into the heart of global economics, technology, and security. As new alliances and high-stakes energy deals unfold, one question keeps everyone up at night. Are we witnessing the countdown to the next global crisis? Let's pull back the curtain on this high-stakes maritime chessboard. To truly understand why the South China Sea matters, you have to start with geography and economics. This patch of ocean is squeezed between China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. It's not just local pride on the line. Its shipping lanes form the jugular vein of international trade, over $3 trillion in goods sales through these waters every year. That's almost 20% of all global trade. Electronics from Korea, oil to China, meat and cars to the rest of Southeast Asia. Below the waves, potentially enormous reserves of oil and natural gas rivaling the North Sea or the Gulf of Mexico. And for millions, the South China Sea is also their supermarket, yielding fish that feed much of the region. But the sea is carved up by a tangle of overlapping claims, and it all starts with China's infamous 9-dash line. This sweeping boundary, drawn by Beijing decades ago, encircles almost the entire South China Sea. It overlaps with territory claimed by the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and even Indonesia's economic zone near the Natuna Islands. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in 2016 that China's historical claims have no legal basis. China flatly rejected the verdict. Since then, the pace of incidents has only accelerated. China builds artificial islands, fortifies reefs with radar and missiles, and sends its Coast Guard and fishing fleets deep into disputed waters. Philippine, Vietnamese, and Malaysian navies grow increasingly assertive in response. The U.S. Navy, determined to uphold freedom of navigation, regularly sails destroyers and flies jets nearby, challenging Chinese activities. And now, a new layer: joint drills involving Japan, the U.S., and newly emboldened Philippine forces. Why now? The last few months have brought a cascade of events. On June 18, 2025, Philippine and Japanese Coast Guards held joint drills just off Manila. 3 days before, U.S. and Philippine warplanes streaked across the sky over the South China Sea. ASEAN, the 10-nation Southeast Asian bloc, broke with tradition and publicly expressed grave concern after a string of hostile encounters. Meanwhile, a Bloomberg report revealed the region's fishing yields have plummeted by 30% in just a decade. Devastating news for the millions who rely on these waters for their livelihood. In response, the Asian Development Bank has pledged $500 million for fisheries management, an unprecedented sum, and a signal that the economic fallout is forcing the world to pay attention. Yet the confrontations continue. In May, the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet sailed close to the Paracel Islands, while in the same month, Chinese Coast Guard vessels reportedly used water cannons against Filipino fishing boats near the Scarborough Shoal, prompting an angry Manila to summon China's ambassador. Vietnam's Coast Guard reports a sharp uptick in Chinese patrols near the contested Vanguard Bank. Malaysia and Vietnam, longtime rivals, set aside differences to agree on joint energy development in Block SK-308, even as Indonesia's navy intercepts Chinese vessels allegedly protecting illegal fishing just off the Natuna Islands. It's enough to make your head spin. But for those living in the region, these aren't abstract diplomatic games. They're daily battles for survival, sovereignty, and security. Each new incident pushes us closer to a tipping point, warns Dr. Aries Arugay of the University of the Philippines. What we're seeing is not just posturing, it's a genuine realignment of regional alliances. It raises the obvious question: if everyone recognizes the risks, why can't they stop this dangerous escalation? A big part of the answer lies in the tangled web of interests and the sharply contrasting approaches of the region's players. China, confident in its economic and military clout, continues its expansion. For Beijing, the South China Sea isn't just a resource trove, it's a strategic shield for its southern coast and a vital artery for its own energy imports. As Bill Hayton, A Chatham House expert notes, control of these sea lanes isn't just about pride, it's a core element of China's long-term security doctrine. But China's actions are hardening resistance elsewhere. The Philippines, especially under recent leadership, has tilted hard toward the US and Japan. In Manila, there's growing resolve not just to protest, but to physically push back. The Philippines Navy is not a match for China's on its own, but with support from Washington and Tokyo, it's seeking to rewrite the balance of power in real time. Meanwhile, Vietnam is quietly shoring up its coast guard and military presence. Malaysia, which for decades avoided open confrontation, now signs joint ventures with neighbors and firms up its own military investments. Malaysia's approach is a delicate balancing act, says Dr. Thomas Daniel of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. We want Chinese investment, but we won't yield on our maritime rights. Indonesia, often on the periphery, is dragged into the fray as Chinese fishing fleets test its boundaries. The ASEAN bloc, which could present a united political front, instead finds itself divided. Some members, like Cambodia, are seen as tilting toward China. Others, like Vietnam and the Philippines, want a much tougher line. As all these threads intertwine, the risk of accidental or even intentional clashes grows. U.S. freedom of navigation operations, like the one near the Paracels last month, draw sharp protests from Beijing. On the water, tense standoffs are no longer rare, they're routine. With so many militaries rubbing shoulders, one miscalculation could spiral out of control. Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund puts it bluntly. Every encounter between coast guards or navies is a roll of the dice. One sudden move, one mistaken signal, and we could see the crisis escalate much faster than anyone wants. For local economies, the costs are already mounting. The fishing collapse threatens food security from Vietnam to Indonesia. Energy investments are on a knife edge. As tempers flare, the risk of economic contagion spreads, potentially dragging in global supply chains, insurance markets, even technology flows as undersea cables and shipping lanes are threatened. The European Union, normally a distant observer, has now weighed in to support the 2016 arbitration ruling. Yet the reality on the water is unchanged. China continues its island building, others rush to catch up. The Asian Development Bank's $500 million signal underscores just how expensive this crisis has become, not just for governments, but for millions of ordinary people. Yet for all the tension, there's no clear mechanism for de-escalation. ASEAN has talked about a code of conduct for 2 decades, but each year, hopes for a binding agreement stall. As Professor Nguyen Hung of Vietnam's Diplomatic Academy laments, without ASEAN unity, China will keep pressing its advantage, and the rest of us are forced to react, not shape the outcome. Could we see a diplomatic breakthrough, or are we drifting toward an accidental war, sparked by a handful of fishing boats and patrol vessels? Are these waters fated to become the fault line for global conflict in the 21st century? And most crucially, how much longer can the region and the world afford to dance on the edge of crisis? In the next chapter, we'll dive deep into the potential scenarios, from rapid military escalation to economic cold wars, to unlikely but crucial diplomatic breakthroughs that could change the fate of Asia and the global trading system itself. Welcome back to our deep dive into the South China Sea, one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. In the first part, we broke down the growing tensions, the actors at play, and the looming economic and security risks. Now it's time to look ahead. What's next for the region? What might actually happen if things go wrong or go right? And most importantly, what lessons does this hold far beyond the shores of Southeast Asia? Let's start by imagining what tomorrow could bring. Experts warn that the situation has entered a new and volatile phase. As Dr. Aries Arugay from the University of the Philippines bluntly puts it, each new joint exercise, each new standoff at sea, is like another log being thrown on a growing fire. The key question is, will that fire spark an all-out blaze? Picture this. It's a humid morning in July. A Filipino fishing boat crowded with crew sails near Scarborough Shoal, waters it has fished for generations. Suddenly, it's met with a wall of spray from a Chinese Coast Guard water cannon. Alarms sound, radio traffic spikes. Nearby, an American P-8 surveillance plane circles overhead. Within hours, social media in Manila and Beijing are ablaze with outrage. Naval vessels are redeployed. The world watches the familiar script of confrontation unfold. But this time, a miscalculation leads to a collision. Shots are fired, not enough to start a full-scale war, but enough to leave both sides humiliated and rattled. Such an accident is no longer far-fetched. In the last month alone, There have been more than half a dozen near misses reported between Chinese, Vietnamese, and Philippine ships. Each incident piles tension on tension. Dr. Colin Koh of Singapore's RSIS puts it plainly. The more you have these high-stakes encounters, the higher the risk that human error or nationalist fervor tips the balance. What happens next in this scenario? First, financial markets tumble. Ship insurers jack up prices for vessels transiting the South China Sea. Asian stock indices slide, the global supply chain shudders. Oil prices spike as tankers are rerouted. In Manila and Hanoi, nationalist protests fill the streets. Hardliners in Beijing and Washington trade threats. Suddenly, not just the region but the world economy feels the tremors of a confrontation that, just 24 hours earlier, seemed avoidable. But let's step back. Is outright conflict the only way forward? Not necessarily. There are other paths, some more hopeful, but none easy. Consider the economic Cold War scenario. Here, actual shooting is avoided, but the region is gripped by tit-for-tat sanctions, naval blockades, and suspended trade. China could ban key agricultural imports from the Philippines or Vietnam. ASEAN nations might boycott Chinese investment projects. Critical supply chains, think microchips, rare earths, or seafood, are disrupted. Everyday people, from fishermen in Da Nang to tech factory workers in Shenzhen, start to feel the squeeze. Bonnie Glaser, director at the German Marshall Fund, warns, escalation doesn't have to mean missiles flying. Cut off the flow of goods, cut off trust, and you create a slow-burning crisis that's just as dangerous. Yet there's still a glimmer of hope. Imagine a different morning. At an ASEAN summit, spurred by recent scares, leaders hammer out a genuinely binding code of conduct for the South China Sea. It's not perfect, but it lays out clear rules: who can fish where, how disputes are to be handled, and what happens if a standoff occurs. They agree on direct military hotlines between coast guards, shared fisheries management, and joint energy development zones. China, feeling economic pressure and diplomatic isolation, grudgingly signs on. The U.S. pulls back its military presence just enough to give diplomacy a chance. Tensions don't disappear, but the specter of war recedes. But what makes diplomacy so hard? The answer, says Dr. Thomas Daniel of Malaysia's Institute of Strategic and International Studies, is a mix of pride, history, and politics. No one wants to look weak at home. Every government, Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese, faces pressure from its own people to stand firm. It takes real courage to compromise. That's the real bind. None of these countries can easily back down without risking political fallout at home. And the South China Sea isn't just about territory, it's about identity, nationalism, and the promise of resources for future generations. So, what does all this mean for you, watching from halfway around the world, or perhaps right on the region's doorstep? First, recognize that global security is increasingly interlinked. The chips in your smartphone, the shoes on your feet, the tuna in your sushi, all may have passed through or been fished from the South China Sea. A flare-up there doesn't just threaten jets and warships, it threatens the invisible arteries of the global economy. Lesson 1. Don't take maritime peace for granted. Much like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz, the South China Sea is a choke point. Disrupt it and ripple effects hit everywhere, at the gas pump, in the supermarket, or on your next online order. Lesson 2. Diplomacy isn't just for politicians. Public awareness and pressure matter. Nations in Southeast Asia are finding new strength by working together, whether through ASEAN, environmental partnerships, or quietly behind the scenes. Citizen activism, protests, and public debate shape the choices leaders make. Social media outrage can escalate tensions, but it can also push for peace. Lesson 3. Complexity is the norm. It's tempting to see the South China Sea as a simple story of good guys versus bad guys, or just about big powers bullying small ones. But reality is messier. For example, Malaysia's approach, as Dr. Daniel notes, is to balance economic engagement with China and a firm defense of maritime rights. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy. Every country calibrates its moves, hedging bets and keeping options open. If you're a student, an investor, a policymaker, or simply a concerned citizen, understanding these moving pieces gives you an edge. It gives you context next time you hear about a standoff at sea or spot a new headline on supply chain shortages. It sharpens your critical thinking and your empathy for those caught in the crossfire. Now let's return to our core question. Will the South China Sea spiral into disaster, or can diplomacy prevail? The answer for now is uncertain, but not hopeless. The forces pushing toward confrontation, national pride, resource hunger, great power rivalry, are real and, in many ways, growing. Yet so are the incentives to avoid catastrophe, economic interdependence, the threat of regional instability, and mounting pressure from an alarmed public and anxious investors. The next years will be decided not just in war rooms but in boardrooms, on fishing docks, and at negotiating tables. Dr. Nguyen Hung from Vietnam's Diplomatic Academy sums it up. If ASEAN can find its voice and speak as one, it can shape the outcome. But disunity is an invitation to chaos. Here's a secret fact you might not have heard. At their lowest point, when fisheries were collapsing and tempers were hottest, a small group of Filipino and Vietnamese marine scientists secretly collaborated. Their joint surveys, conducted quietly while politicians argued, helped lay the groundwork for later fisheries agreements. It's a reminder that even when diplomacy seems stuck, ordinary people can help build bridges below the surface. So the South China Sea's fate is not set in stone. History is full of moments where confrontation could have hardened into disaster, but instead, smart minds found ways to step back from the brink. If this story gripped you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share the video, like and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think states will find the courage to compromise, or are we headed for a new era of maritime Cold War? And what other global hotspots deserve a deep dive? Your voice could help shape the conversation.